one day somebody does something unspeakable to someone else, to someone you hardly knew, and you do something about it, because you can.
This story comes to us from the Indianapolis Star. A federal judge said the murder case that sent Dwayne Dunn to prison for more than a dozen years was not a strong one. The only two witnesses supported Dunn's claim that his next-door neighbor, Angel Torres, accidentally fell down a flight of stairs as the two men were fighting. Both witnesses said they never saw Dunn bludgeon Torres to death, as prosecutors alleged, with a weapon that was never found. And if not for the subpar performance of Dunn's attorney, as written in a judge's order, there is a reasonable probability that he would have been acquitted. Now, that order granted Dunn's petition challenging his 2011 conviction in Elkhart, and a federal appeals court upheld the ruling 2 years later. The case was later dismissed, but not before Dunn had spent 13 years in prison. He was just exonerated. He is now suing, alleging police and prosecutors fabricated evidence to wrongfully convict him. Dunn is the sixth person to be exonerated in Elkhart after spending years, even decades, in prison. To date, Elkhart officials have agreed to pay $26.6 million to settle allegations of misconduct that led to wrongful convictions. Who's going to pay? Most recently, city officials reached a partial settlement of $11.7 million with Andrew Royer, a mentally disabled man who spent 16 years behind bars after falsely confessing to murder. Now, Dunn's lawsuit is one of 3 civil rights cases filed against Elkhart officials. Former Detective Joy Phillips, who sued her former employer earlier this month, alleges the police department and several officers ruined her reputation and took away her livelihood after she refused to sign what she believed to be a bogus search warrant. Good on her. Elkhart resident Hakeem Lehman, whose 2020 arrest was captured in a viral video, is also suing, accusing police officers of racially profiling and fabricating evidence against him. Now, Corinne Strait, a spokeswoman for the city and Elkhart Mayor Rod Roberson's office, said in a statement that the lawsuits are tried in a court of law and not the press. A follow-up statement, however, acknowledged the need for changes. They said, these lawsuits are not tried in the press. They are, trust me. When Mayor Roberson took office in 2020, he did so with a commitment to reform and accountability in the Elkhart Police Department and a commitment to raise the level of professionalism throughout the ranks of the department. Strait said all of the lawsuits center upon the conduct of former Elkhart police officers. While the city does not concede the claims of any of the suits, these suits are not reflective of today's Elkhart Police Department. We believe that. Yeah, right. Elliot Slosar, an attorney for the Chicago law firm Lovey and Lovey, represents all 3 plaintiffs. He has long said there has been an epidemic of police and prosecutorial misconduct in Elkhart. Dunn's wrongful conviction, for example, demonstrates a pattern of systemic misconduct in the halls of the Elkhart Police Department and the Elkhart County Prosecutor's Office. Elkhart County Prosecutor Vicki Becker, who was elected in 2016, said she's unable to comment on the allegations outside the judicial process. Now, Dunn, 62, was charged with murder in 2010, about a year and a half after Torres died. The 2 men who lived in an adjacent second-floor apartments got in a fight on September 3rd of 2008. In their shared balcony, they struggled over a bat that Torres was holding. The 2 eyewitnesses, Dunn's then-girlfriend and her son, both heard Dunn telling Torres, "Stop hitting him with the bat." The son, Jamar Sims, saw Torres fall backwards down the steps and hit the pavement head first, he testified. His mother, Letha Sims, testified she rushed out to the balcony after hearing a thud and saw Torres at the bottom of the stairs with the bat underneath him. Prosecutors allege that Dunn pushed Torres down the stairs and then bludgeoned him to death with a different weapon that was never found. But neither of the eyewitnesses said they saw Dunn push or beat Torres. The unknown weapon, which was never found, an autopsy found Torres died of massive blunt trauma to the head, but the manner of death was uncertain. Now, the state relied on two other witnesses, a Fort Wayne forensic pathologist, of course, who reviewed the autopsy and concluded that Torres' skull was crushed like gravel, injuries consistent with an accidental fall, and an Indiana State Police blood splatter specialist who testified bloodstains found at the scene were caused by impact splatter. So they relied on these two witnesses who basically support the police. The state presented the case as a binary choice between two trustworthy experts and two eyewitnesses who lied. But all this tells us that the witnesses are not telling the truth. People lie. It happens, Becker told jurors. And you know, we can use terms like you don't find swans in a sewer. This area where they're living, the lifestyle they're living, we can't pick our witnesses. It's trying to say they're ghetto. Dunn was convicted in February 2011 after a 3-day trial. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. He served 13. After his post-conviction hearing, another expert who reviewed the evidence contradicted the prosecution's witnesses. Dr. Thomas Sozio, a forensic pathologist from Fishers, testified that Torres' injuries were included in a small laceration on his scalp and a straight-line break of several ribs, were not consistent with being battered to death. Sozio concluded that Torres' chronic alcoholism put him at greater risk of his bones breaking. Now, in his 2020 ruling granting Dunn's petition, Simon pointing out that weaknesses in the state's case. If Dunn bludgeoned Torres after he fell, why did he stay at the crime scene? And although Torres' blood was on Dunn's shoes, it simply shows that he walked around the scene, Simon wrote in his order. Simon also said the state's allegation that Letha and Jamar Sims were liars loses much of its traction when backed by the testimony of another expert, Sozio. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit upheld Simon's ruling in a 2-1 decision, writing that Sozio's testimony was critical to creating reasonable doubt. The appeals court also wrote that if Dunn beat Torres with a weapon that became so saturated with blood that it created blood spatter at the crime scene, as prosecutors allege, the absence of blood on Dunn's clothes diminishes that argument. He didn't have any blood on his clothes, but yet he beat this guy so blood went everywhere. Dunn was finally freed in 2022. In his lawsuit, Dunn also names as defendants Michael Sigsby, an Elkhart police officer, who he allegedly forced Letha Sims to say she saw Dunn kick Torres. He is also suing the two state experts, Fort Wayne forensic pathologist Scott Wagner and Indiana State Police blood spatter specialist Dean Marks, who Dunn alleges fabricated their findings at the prosecution's behest. Now, Dwayne Dunn says, at first I couldn't believe it was happening, but then once I got in prison, I was like, I can't let them get away with this. He said his wrongful conviction took away not only his freedom, but also his ability to make a living, to see his grandsons grow up, and to be there when loved ones died. While he was in prison, he lost 3 brothers and an uncle. He didn't even get to say goodbye. He says, my sons had to see me in prison. He has 3 sons. He says, I had to meet my grandkids in prison. And after one visit, Dunn says he was about to go back to his cell. One of his grandsons, a toddler at the time, asked to stay with him. He says his grandson said, Papa, can I go with you? He says to hear him say that hurts. I mean, that had to break your heart. On November 4th of 2022, after federal courts ruled in Dunn's favor, Becker's office filed a notice that it would not retry Dunn. Of course. Dunn was released a few days later. He had spent nearly 13 years behind bars. He said, when you're in prison, you're behind a wall. You're in a little cell. You're not only in prison physically, you're in prison here too, he says. When you're black, you're almost found guilty, he added. It just don't happen that you're innocent. And that's so true. With law enforcement today, a lot of times you're guilty until you prove your innocence. True. That's so true. You're guilty until you can prove you're innocent. A lot of times in court today. You do you see these First Amendment audits. And I don't do them anymore too much. I can't remember the last time. Well, I did an audit on Fort Dix, New Jersey recently, but I remember one I did in Rancho Cucamonga. I did a First Amendment audit, and the cop came out, and before he even talked to anybody, the deputy came up to me, a San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy out of Rancho Cucamonga, and he said, so you were trying to get into the building, you were pulling on the door. I had been on the sidewalk the entire time, and my camera was running the whole time. And I said, no, I've never left the sidewalk. Well, they claim that you went up there and you were pulling on the door trying to get in. I was already guilty. He made up his mind before he even got out there. And I said, no, I wasn't. I've been on the sidewalk the whole time. Well, could I see your video? No, when you leave, I'll put stop and then I'll post it and you can go back and watch it. And he ended up leaving, of course. But he had already made up his mind when he got out there. They called. They said, this guy's doing this. So he walked up to me and said, well, they said you were doing this. And I said, I don't care what they were saying. I've been on the sidewalk the whole time. But that's law enforcement for you. We got the call, so we know you were doing it because they told us, they called us. Really? You haven't asked anybody anything, you haven't investigated a piece of evidence, and already you know I'm guilty of something. You see what I'm saying, though? We'll just prove it in court. Tell the judge. That's how law enforcement is today. That's your American law enforcement.